A 4-year war changes how risk behaves, and most organizations still haven't adapted. This conflict began in February 2022. 4 years later, Russian controls about 5,600 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory it did not hold before, not because of a single breakthrough, but because of consistent pressure applied over time. That matters because it tells us something important. This war didn't stall, it didn't freeze, it didn't fail. It worked, just not in the dramatic way most people expected. There was no collapse of Ukraine, no Russian blitzkrieg, no decisive escalation that forced an outcome. Instead, territory was taken slowly, infrastructure was damaged repeatedly, pressure was applied every month, every season, year after year. From an intelligence perspective, this is not a war rushing toward an end. It is a war that has settled into a system. And systems like this don't just move front lines, they change how risk builds up, how markets behave, and how organizations need to plan. Before we go any further, if you find this analysis useful, a like or a comment helps it reach the people it's meant for. Now let's look at what actually changed in 2025 and why 2026 starts from a very different position. What happened in 2025? Looking back, the key point is simple. The war did not resolve, it evolved. Throughout the year, Russian forces continued a campaign focused on attrition, wearing Ukraine down across land, air, energy, and logistics. On the ground, Russia made measurable territorial gains, not sudden advances, but steady ones. Independent assessments show that Russian forces captured roughly 5,600 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory in 2025, the highest rate of land gain since the early phase of the invasion. At the same time, Russia increased attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. Energy grids were repeatedly hit. Rail networks were targeted. Urban centers experienced sustained missile and drone strikes. More than 1,100 attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure were recorded during the year, leading to rolling blackouts and repeated disruptions to daily life. These strikes were not limited to the front lines. Energy facilities deep inside western Ukraine and civilian infrastructure in Kyiv were repeatedly hit. It was not random, it was a deliberate pattern designed to reduce Ukraine's resilience and raise the long term cost of resistance. At the same time, Ukraine did not collapse. Ukrainian forces adapted. They improved air and missile defense. They struck Russian logistics and supply nodes. They targeted Russian oil infrastructure and vessels used to bypass sanctions. By the end of 2025, the result was clear pattern. Russia gained territory, but at a high cost. Ukraine held the line, but under constant pressure. Neither side achieved a decisive outcome. The war settled into a strategic deadlock, sustained by external support and internal endurance. By late 2025, intelligence assessments were clear. This war had shifted away from maneuver warfare to industrial scale attrition. That means continuous cycle of attack, defense, repair, and repeat. Three realities drive this. First, both sides are exhausted. Russia can still advance but lacks the manpower and reserves to achieve a decisive collapse. Ukraine can still defend but pays consistent price in infrastructure damage and economic strain. Second, Ukraine's defense strategy has matured. It now focuses on survival and endurance rather than counteroffensives, trading space where necessary, and integrating Western systems to slow Russian gains. Third, the economic cost of the war is reshaping domestic limits. Russia's wartime economy has slowed, forcing new taxes and physical measures. Ukraine's economy continues to operate under repeated infrastructure shocks. This is not a paused war, it is a permanent pressure environment. The components of the conflict are now normalized. The tempo is sustained. The war no longer has a clear beginning or end point. As 2026 begins, the battlefield situation has not dramatically changed. What has changed is the wider strategic posture, especially from the United States. In early 2026, the US expanded its role beyond military aid and sanctions paperwork. American naval and law enforcement assets began actively interdicting Russian shadow fleet oil tankers, vessels used to move sanctioned oil to generate revenue for Moscow. These interdictions were not symbolic, they directly targeted the economic flows that helped Russia's war effort. And at the same time, Washington signaled a broader shift in posture. The Trump administration began publicly advancing plans to integrate Greenland more closely into US strategic control, not because of Ukraine directly, but because the Arctic energy routes and Northern Atlantic security are now tied into the same competition with Russia. Taken together, these moves show something important. The US is no longer just supporting Ukraine, it is actively shaping the environment around Russia, using sanctions enforcement, maritime power, and strategic geography. This does not mean escalation to war. This means pressure is being applied on more fronts without crossing formal thresholds, which is also known as the grey zone. That is the 2026 start state. Why this matters systematically. The key shift is this: the Russia Ukraine war is no longer measured by battles or offensives. It is measured by endurance, by infrastructure resilience, by economic sustainability, by political staying power. This has wider consequences. The energy markets remain sensitive to infrastructure damage and export disruption. European defense planning is now built around long term confrontation. NATO readiness is tested by a conflict that never fully escalates but never ends. For corporations, the risk is not limited to Ukraine itself. Supply chains that pass through Eastern Europe remain exposed. Energy prices continue to reflect long term instability. Insurance markets are pricing in uncertainty, not shock. This war does not crash markets overnight, it bends them slowly. What to watch next? In 2026, the key signal will not be dramatic. They will look like continued Western integration into Ukraine's defense, ongoing Russian missile and drone campaigns, expanded use of sanctions enforcement and maritime interdiction powers, diplomatic talks that manage the conflict but don't resolve it. This is not escalation toward war, it is competition under restraint. Waiting for a decisive moment is a mistake. What matters now is continuous pressure and cumulative effort. The war in Ukraine is not ending, it is enduring, it is evolving, and in 2026, the strategic environment is defined not by sudden change, but by entrenched competition. This is the Grey Zone Brief, and if you found this analysis useful, subscribe so you don't miss future briefings, and if you know somebody making decisions in complex environments, share it with them. I'll see you on the next episode.